The year was 1922. West Virginia, a place where the Appalachian Mountains rolled like sleeping giants, where valleys were quiet until coal trains rattled their way through. Life here was simple on the surface, a mixture of hard labor in the mines, church gatherings on Sundays, and the occasional small-town celebration that broke the monotony of rural life. But beneath that stillness, beneath the folklore and the hymns sung in wooden chapels, there was also fear. Fear of sickness, fear of poison, and fear of things that could not be explained. It was in such a setting that one of the strangest and most unsettling stories emerged. A wedding should have been a time of joy, a gathering of families, neighbors, and friends who brought gifts of bread, honey, and laughter. The bride was young, hopeful, wearing a dress sewn by her own mother's hands. The groom, proud and nervous, carried the weight of a new life beginning. Guests filled the hall, carrying baskets of food, pies cooled on windowsills, jugs of cider that sparkled under the dim lamplight. Music began to play, and for a few hours, the mountains echoed with the sound of dancing feet. But when night fell, something shifted. Plates were cleared, but whispers started. A few guests felt dizzy. The child clutched his stomach. An older man staggered outside and vomited behind the barn. Soon, the joyous laughter was replaced with groans, and the smell of sickness filled the air. No one could explain it at first. Some believed it was bad cider. Others thought spoiled meat. But as the hours turned into days and the sick grew weaker, a darker suspicion crept in. Had the wedding feast itself been poisoned? The bride, pale and trembling, sat by her mother's side as rumors spiraled. Some whispered of an enemy within the family, someone who could not bear the union and sought to end it with cruelty. Others turned to old superstition, recalling tales of curses and hexes whispered in the Appalachian night. But as more and more guests fell, it became clear this was not merely an accident. The feast had become a silent killer, and no one knew why. The scene of that wedding lingered in memory, the lanterns swaying in the evening breeze, the fiddle music cut short by cries of pain, the tables abandoned with half-eaten bread and untouched cakes. Survivors remembered the faces paling one by one, the sounds of retching echoing in the hills, the sense of confusion and fear that spread faster than the illness itself. What was supposed to bind two families together instead tore a community apart. And here's where the story begins to take on its darkest shape. For in 1922, West Virginia, science was still catching up with superstition. Doctors had theories, but limited tools. Priests offered prayers, but no answers. And neighbors, suspicious of one another, began to wonder if the poison was not in the food at all, but in the hearts of men. Who would bring such a curse to a wedding day? Was it revenge, jealousy, or something even older, something rooted in the soil of the Appalachian Mountains themselves? Imagine the terror of waking up after such a celebration. You had laughed, clapped, raised your glass. You had eaten the bread and stew, and now you lay in your bed with fever running through your body, wondering if you would live to see the next morning. Imagine the faces of the bride and groom, their union forever stained by the tragedy, their wedding dress and suit marked not by joy but by whispers of blood and betrayal. It is this silence, this lingering question, that haunts the story a century later. The poisoned wedding feast is not just a tale of illness. It is a window into the fears and beliefs of a people, a place where celebration could so quickly turn to mourning. It is a reminder that history is not only about battles and kings, but about the small, intimate tragedies that unfold in forgotten towns. And sometimes, those tragedies hold a darkness that feels almost deliberate, as though someone or something intended it to be so. So tonight, let us go back. Let us step into that wedding hall, into the wooden beams and flickering lanterns, into the music that briefly filled the air. Let us meet the bride, the groom, their families, their neighbors. Let us sit at their table, eat their bread, sip their cider, and let us feel with them the creeping shadow of fear as the night of joy turns into a night of horror. Because once you hear this story, you may never look at a wedding feast the same way again. To understand the shadows that fell over the poisoned wedding feast of 1922, we must first step back into the world that shaped it. The Appalachians of West Virginia were not merely a backdrop of quiet forests and winding rivers. They were a crucible of hardship, resilience, and superstition. Families had lived in these hollows for generations, isolated by geography and bound together by labor, faith, and folklore. The coal mines gave work to many, yet they also demanded sacrifice. Lungs blackened by dust, backs bent by endless digging, and lives cut short by cave-ins and explosions. Around these dangerous labors, communities built their own rhythms of survival, often clinging to traditions that reached back to the old countries of Scotland, Ireland, and Germany, from which many of their ancestors came. Daily life in rural West Virginia was stark and disciplined. Men rose before dawn, many descending into the mines with little more than a tin pail of food and a carbide lamp strapped to their helmets. Women kept homes alive, cooking, tending gardens, raising children, sewing clothes, and preserving food for long winters. Children learned early to work, whether carrying coal, gathering firewood, or helping with the crops. In such a world, a wedding was more than just a union of two young hearts. It was a rare chance for joy, a communal celebration that reminded everyone of continuity, family, and the fragile hope of something brighter than daily toil. Churches anchored these small towns. Wooden chapels dotted the hillsides, their bells carrying across valleys on Sunday mornings. Sermons warned of sin and promised redemption, but they also reinforced the tight moral codes that governed life. Neighbors watched one another closely, not always with kindness, but with a sharp awareness that survival depended on order. Rumors carried fast along dirt roads, and reputation could be as vital as bread. In such a climate, suspicion thrived. A small misfortune, a cow gone dry, a child falling sick, bread spoiling too soon, could be blamed on unseen malice. Some whispered of witchcraft, others of curses, while others still leaned on new but limited medical explanations. At the turn of the century, America itself was changing rapidly. Cities grew with factories, immigrants poured into ports, and the country leapt forward with new technologies, electric lights, automobiles, telephones. But in the hollows of Appalachia, change was slower. Roads were rough, electricity reached few homes, and telephones were luxuries. Folk remedies were trusted as much as doctors, and the wisdom of elders was often valued over textbooks. In West Virginia, superstition lived side by side with faith, and both colored the way people understood tragedy. Weddings in these communities reflected that blend of old and new. A wedding was not merely about the bride and groom, but about the joining of two families, sometimes even two clans. Preparations could take weeks. Women baked pies and cakes in wood stove ovens. Men butchered hogs or chickens. Cider was brewed and beer sometimes smuggled in. Guests traveled miles on horseback or by wagon, arriving in dusty boots and their best Sunday clothes. Music filled the barns and church halls. Fiddles, banjos, guitars, voices raised in songs carried from the old country but reshaped in mountain twang. Such gatherings were rare and precious. They were meant to be remembered not just by the couple but by the entire community. Yet such gatherings also carried risk. Food preservation was difficult before refrigeration. Meat could spoil quickly, milk could turn sour, and improper canning could create toxins invisible to the eye. Many had heard stories of families struck down by bad meat or tainted preserves. In an era when knowledge of botulism or foodborne pathogens was still emerging, illness after a feast might be explained as divine punishment, malicious intent, or simply bad luck. And in an atmosphere where grudges lingered between families, feuding over land, or neighbors fighting over resources, the idea of deliberate poisoning was never far from mind. By 1922, West Virginia itself was in turmoil. The coal wars had erupted, with miners striking for fair wages and safer conditions, leading to violent clashes with company guards and even federal troops. The Matewan Massacre of 1920 and the Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921 had already burned themselves into local memory. Communities were tense, divided between loyalty to company bosses or to unions, and suspicion ran like wildfire. Against this backdrop, any unexplained death or illness could be interpreted as sabotage, revenge, or the settling of old scores. In such a climate, a wedding, normally a promise of peace, could just as easily become a stage for conflict. Culture, too, played its part. Appalachia was rich in storytelling. Tales of spirits, curses, and dark omens passed from mouth to mouth, keeping alive a worldview where the natural and supernatural blurred. It was not uncommon to hear of witches who could sour milk, of hexes carved into barn doors, of spirits haunting abandoned cabins. Even those who laughed at such stories often carried a private unease, especially when tragedy struck without reason. For the poisoned wedding feast, these cultural undercurrents shaped how people understood what had happened. Was it spoiled food, a malicious act, or something far older, a curse that lay in wait? The geography itself deepened the sense of isolation. The Appalachian Mountains formed barriers of stone and forest. Travel was slow, sometimes impossible in winter. A sickness in one valley might remain a mystery in another. This meant that tragedies were often magnified in local memory, retold again and again until they took on the qualities of legend. A poisoned feast was not just an unfortunate accident, it became part of the folklore, whispered about at firesides and in churchyards, a cautionary tale woven into the fabric of the community. Science was advancing, yes, but slowly. Doctors of the 1920s knew of bacteria, of toxins, of the dangers of contaminated food, but rural doctors often lacked equipment, medicine, or even transportation to reach patients in time. Diagnosis was uncertain, and treatment limited to purges, tonics, or prayer. In the absence of clear explanations, suspicion filled the gap. If too many people fell ill at once, it was easier to imagine deliberate malice than invisible microbes. And if death followed, grief quickly sought a cause, whether natural or human. The social order of West Virginia, with its tight-knit families, its feuds, its religious fervor, and its cultural superstitions, created the perfect storm for suspicion when tragedy struck. A poisoned feast, whether intentional or accidental, could tear apart not just the families directly involved, but the entire fabric of the community. Neighbors eyed one another differently. Old grudges reignited. Ministers preached against sin. Doctors struggled to explain, and newspapers, hungry for stories of rural mystery, spread the tale far beyond the mountains. What began as one wedding's tragedy became a narrative that belonged to the region itself. And so, when the wedding guests of 1922 fell ill, they did not do so in a vacuum. Their suffering was shaped by generations of hardship, by the clash of old folklore and modern science, by the harsh realities of coal country and the fragile hopes of rural families. The poisoned wedding feast was not only a single night of horror, it was the eruption of deeper tensions, fears, and mysteries that had always haunted the Appalachian hills. The day of the wedding began as so many others had in the hills of West Virginia. The air was crisp with late spring warmth, and families arrived carrying baskets of food, jars of preserves, and loaves of bread. Children ran about the yard, kicking up dust while mothers shooed them away from the tables. A fiddler tuned his strings in the corner of the barn, his bow humming softly like a warning. Inside, the tables groaned with offering stews bubbling in iron pots. Chickens roasted until their skin cracked, pies stacked high with sugared fruit. It was the kind of feast the community would remember with fondness, or so they thought. The first incident seemed small. A young boy, no more than 8, staggered while playing. He clutched his belly, his face paling as though all light drained from him. His mother rushed to his side, assuming he had eaten too quickly. She carried him to a bench, fanning his face with her apron. The fiddler stopped mid-song, the bow hanging in the air. Whispers rippled through the crowd, but soon the boy vomited violently, staining the earth beside the barn with half-digested bread and cider. A hush fell over the tables. Some laughed nervously, calling it childish gluttony. Others frowned, unease gnawing at their stomachs like a worm in the apple. But unease became dread when the second guest collapsed. An elderly man, known for his stubborn vigor, dropped his fork, his hand trembling as though gripped by invisible claws. His body convulsed, jerking against the table until dishes shattered around him. The bride, still flushed from her first dance, froze as the man's eyes rolled back, his mouth foaming. Women screamed, chairs overturned, and the smell of sickness clashed with roasted meat. Someone cried out, "It's the food!" And a silence heavier than stone settled across the room. From that moment, the feast unraveled into horror. One by one, guests felt the sickness claw its way through their bodies. Some collapsed where they sat, groaning with pain. Others stumbled outside, their retching echoing against the hills. The bride's younger sister fainted, her white dress stained with the vomit of the man she tried to help. A jug of cider was overturned, spilling dark liquid across the wooden floor like blood. In the chaos, a dog howled outside, its cry cutting through the night like a blade. The third incident came like a curse. A middle-aged woman, well-loved in the community, staggered toward the door to breathe fresh air. She fell just as she reached the threshold, striking her head against the jamb with a dull crack. Blood ran into her hair as she twitched, her hands clawing at the dirt floor. The bride screamed, her voice breaking into sobs. The groom tried to lift the woman, but she convulsed so violently that others pulled him back in fear. Some whispered that it was no mere illness, but poison placed deliberately in the food. Eyes darted across the hall, suspicion already taking root like rot in timber. As the night stretched on, the feast became a battlefield. Men staggered like soldiers wounded by an unseen enemy. Women wailed over their children. The fiddler sat down his bow and crossed himself, muttering a prayer. The lanterns flickered, shadows stretching long across the faces twisted with agony. The smell of sickness grew unbearable, sour, metallic, laced with blood and bile. Bread lay half-eaten, pies untouched, stew congealing in its pot. The very sight of food became grotesque, each dish transformed from a gift into a weapon. One guest, a young miner, tried to force himself to vomit, clawing at his throat with dirty nails until blood streaked his chin. Another fell into violent seizures, his body rattling against the wooden floor until he lay still, his chest rising shallowly. Mothers wept as their children curled into themselves, clutching their stomachs as if holding in their souls. A man, delirious with pain, seized a carving knife from the table and slashed at his own arm, screaming that the poison was in his blood and had to be let out. Others restrained him, but his blood spilled across the table, dripping into bowls of stew as though sealing the curse. Hours dragged on. The bride and groom, once the center of joy, now became symbols of dread. The bride sat pale and trembling, her dress stained with vomit and blood, her eyes wide with shock. The groom tried to help, carrying water, holding trembling hands, whispering prayers. But with each collapse, with each body that fell to the ground, suspicion shifted toward them. Some muttered that the union itself was cursed. Others whispered of jealous suitors, of feuds between families, of an old woman seen muttering near the food earlier that day. Every explanation was darker than the last. By dawn, the once joyous hall was silent but for the groans of the ill. The tables were abandoned, dishes broken, food rotting under the first light of day. The bride's veil lay crumpled on the floor, trampled in the chaos. The groom's hands were stained with blood from those he tried to lift. Outside, the grass was spattered with bile, and the earth reeked of sickness. The surviving guests sat, in clusters, eyes hollow, watching as neighbors fought for breath. The feast had become a graveyard without graves. As days passed, the incidents multiplied beyond the wedding night itself. Guests who had seemed fine at first fell ill in their homes. A young man collapsed in his yard, his body twitching as his mother screamed for help. An elderly woman vomited until she choked, her family powerless to save her. Others grew weak, wasting away in their beds, unable to eat or drink. Some survived, their bodies scarred by the ordeal. Others died, their funerals whispered about as if death itself were ashamed of what had been done. The community fractured under the weight of suspicion. Some swore the cider had been poisoned, pointing to a jug that smelled faintly of something bitter. Others blamed the meat, claiming it had spoiled in the spring heat. A few whispered of deliberate malice, of arsenic slipped into pies, of jealousy so deep it demanded blood. Theories spread like wildfire, each one darker than the last, but no explanation could erase the sight of neighbors writhing in pain, of loved ones buried too soon, of a wedding feast transformed into a silent massacre. And so the poisoned wedding feast became more than an event. It became a scar, etched into the memory of every survivor, carried like a shadow through their lives. Each incident, each collapse, each convulsion, each scream was retold in hushed tones, passed down to children who grew up hearing of the night when food turned into death. And in every telling, the horror deepened, until the line between history and legend blurred, and the feast became not just a tragedy, but a haunting. In the days after the poisoned wedding feast, silence hung heavy over the valley. The music that had once carried across the hills was gone, replaced by whispers and the toll of church bells. Coffins were built quickly, sometimes with wood meant for barns or fences, because there were not enough ready to bury the dead. Families who had danced together just days before now stood at gravesides, their faces gray with grief and suspicion. It was as though the celebration had summoned a curse that would not lift. The bride's family became the first to feel the weight of accusation. Neighbors whispered that the food prepared in their kitchen must have carried the poison. Others argued that the groom's family had enemies and that someone had slipped in to ruin the union. Mothers who had once smiled warmly at the young couple now turned cold, keeping their children away. The bride herself, pale and broken, was seen wandering the yard with her veil in her hands, as if trying to wash away the stain of guilt that clung to her family's name. Some pitied her. Others believed she carried the mark of a curse. Doctors were called in from nearby towns, but their answers brought little comfort. Without modern laboratories or reliable tests, they could only guess at the cause. One physician suggested spoiled meat, pointing to the roasted chickens that had sat too long before being served. Another insisted it was cider tainted by fermentation gone wrong. A third whispered privately of arsenic, a poison cheap and accessible, sometimes kept in homes for killing rats. But none could prove their theories. To the families watching their loved ones waste away, the uncertainty was as cruel as the illness itself. In the absence of answers, every rumor seemed possible. Pastors stepped into the void of silence, preaching sermons that blended comfort with warning. Some declared that the tragedy was divine punishment for hidden sins within the community. They reminded their congregations that God's wrath could fall upon even the most joyous of occasions if pride, envy, or wickedness were present. Others tried to soften the blow, speaking of mysterious trials sent to test the faithful, urging forgiveness and prayer. But for many, the sermons deepened suspicion. If punishment had fallen, who had deserved it? Which family had brought the curse upon them all? Newspapers soon caught wind of the tragedy, their headlines hungry for the strange and the macabre. Stories of the poisoned wedding spread far beyond West Virginia, painted with sensational words that suggested murder, conspiracy, and even witchcraft. Reporters described the mountains as places of dark superstition and primitive ways, turning the grief of real families into spectacle. For some in the community, this outside attention was salt in the wound. Their sorrow became entertainment for strangers, their private suffering a curiosity for city readers who would never set foot in the Appalachian hollows. Yet the papers also gave power to the story, ensuring it would not fade into obscurity. Within the community, fear tightened its grip. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. An old feud between two families flared again, with accusations traded in hushed tones. Some claimed to have seen a woman lingering near the food before the feast, her eyes sharp, her lips moving in what might have been a curse. Others swore the groom had once courted another woman who could not bear to see him marry another. None of these whispers were proven, but they spread like wildfire, growing each time they were retold. The poisoned feast became less about spoiled food and more about human malice, about the belief that someone among them had meant for this to happen. Psychologists today might call it collective trauma. But in 1922, the community had no such language. What they had were suspicions, fears, and the human need to assign blame. Some families refused to speak to one another for years afterward. Children grew up hearing their parents say, "Don't trust that family. Remember what happened at the wedding." The tragedy lingered not just in memory but in daily life, shaping friendships, marriages, even the way people chose who to sit beside at church. It was as though poison had seeped not only into the food, but into the very fabric of the community. Science, of course, had its explanations. Historians and medical experts today suggest that the sickness could have been caused by contaminated food, perhaps botulism from improperly canned vegetables, or meat spoiled in the spring heat, or cider that carried toxins after fermentation. Each is plausible, and each could explain the symptoms: nausea, convulsions, fever, even death. But these explanations, though rational, cannot erase the cultural context in which the tragedy unfolded. For the people of West Virginia in 1922, invisible bacteria were harder to believe in than human jealousy or supernatural curses. What they could not see, they replaced with stories, and those stories carried more weight than science. The bride and groom themselves lived under a cloud. They could not escape. Though they had no hand in the tragedy, suspicion clung to them like a second skin. Their marriage began in whispers and shadows, every glance from a neighbor heavy with judgment. Some said they were cursed. Others believed they were innocent, victims of a greater malice. But no one looked at them the same way again. Their wedding day, meant to be remembered as the start of their life together, became instead a story of death and poison that followed them until the end of their days. In the end, the community's reaction was not just about the deaths or the illness. It was about fear, fear of the unknown, fear of betrayal, fear that joy itself could be turned against them. The poisoned feast became a symbol of how quickly life could twist, how even the purest celebrations could be ruined by shadows. And as the story spread, it ceased to belong to the families alone. It became part of West Virginia's folklore, retold by strangers, embroidered with superstition. A tale where the truth mattered less than the haunting power of the memory itself. The nights that followed the poisoned feast were thick with silence. The hills of West Virginia, usually filled with the chorus of crickets and the distant bark of hounds, seemed to hold their breath. Within the homes of the afflicted, oil lamps flickered against walls as families sat vigil beside the sick. The sound of labored breathing became a rhythm of dread, and yet, worse than the sickness itself was the waiting, the not knowing who would recover, who would die, and who might be blamed next. The bride and groom stayed together in the groom's family home, but their union was overshadowed by grief. The bride's white dress hung abandoned, stiff with stains, in the corner of a room she could not bear to enter. The groom tried to comfort her, whispering that the sickness would pass, that time would heal the wound. But even he could not believe his own words. Each day, news came of another guest struck down, another funeral to prepare, another neighbor whispering suspicions in the dark. Their marriage, meant to begin with promise, had instead become the center of a nightmare. It was during one of these long nights that the tension reached its breaking point. The family of a young woman who had died after the feast stormed to the groom's home, demanding answers. Their daughter had been full of life, laughing, singing, dancing, and now she lay in the ground, her body wasted by violent sickness. The father, his hands shaking with grief, accused the bride's family of serving poisoned food. His voice cracked as he shouted that no accident could take so many lives. He demanded justice, vengeance even, his rage spilling out into the yard, where neighbors had gathered to watch. The argument grew louder, sharper, until voices rang out like gunfire across the hollow. Some defended the young couple, insisting they too had suffered. Others muttered that curses often traveled through bloodlines, that perhaps the bride carried misfortune in her veins. The groom stood firm, his jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. But when the grieving father spat at his feet and cursed his name, the air turned thick with the possibility of violence. Men shifted uneasily, hands brushing the grips of knives and pistols. In that moment, the sickness was no longer just in the body. It had seeped into the hearts of the living, threatening to consume them all. Then came the most chilling incident of all. One of the survivors, a miner known for his hard strength, suffered a violent fit in the middle of the crowd. His body convulsed, his eyes rolled back, and he let out a guttural scream that echoed against the hills. Foam spilled from his mouth as his limbs thrashed against the earth. Mothers pulled their children back in terror, believing the devil himself had entered him. The pastor rushed forward, pressing a hand to the man's forehead, praying aloud as if to cast out a demon. The convulsions grew worse until, with a final shudder, the man went still. His chest rose once, then fell forever. The silence that followed was unbearable. The lanterns hissed in the night air, shadows stretching long across faces frozen in horror. The body lay twisted on the ground, eyes open, mouth agape as though still trying to cry out. No one moved at first, too afraid to touch him. Then the grieving father who had shouted moments before fell to his knees beside the corpse, sobbing. His rage had burned out, replaced by despair, his cries carrying up into the mountains like a warning. That night, the community reached its breaking point. Some insisted the sickness had been caused by natural spoilage, that the man's death was simply another cruel hand dealt by bad food. But others were convinced that no accident could bring such violence. They swore that the wedding had been cursed, that someone had poisoned the feast with intent. Fingers pointed in every direction, and for the first time, the bride and groom feared for their own lives. They shut the doors of their home and barred the windows, praying not just against sickness, but against their neighbors. As dawn crept over the ridges, the valley was quiet again. But it was no longer the peaceful silence of rural life. It was the silence of suspicion, of grief too heavy to name. Families buried their dead, but the soil seemed to reject the bodies, as though the land itself did not want to keep their secrets. Men carried coffins into the churchyard, their eyes avoiding one another's. Women wept quietly, their sobs swallowed by the walls of wooden chapels, and children listened to every whispered word, storing them away to remember long after the graves had settled. The climax of the poisoned feast was not one single death, but the breaking of trust. No one looked at their neighbors the same way again. Where once there had been shared meals and laughter, there was now suspicion. The bride and groom lived like shadows, their marriage chained to tragedy. The pastor continued to preach, the doctor continued to guess, the newspapers continued to print, but none could offer closure. The horror had unfolded in full view of the community, and yet no one could name its cause with certainty. That, more than anything, was the true terror. The knowledge that the poison could have been accident or intention, and that either possibility left them forever vulnerable. And so the wedding feast reached its terrible climax, not in music, not in celebration, but in the image of a young man's body convulsing in the dirt, a father's screams echoing into the night, and an entire community bound together by fear, grief, and suspicion. What began as joy had ended in silence, and, in that silence, the memory of the poisoned feast burned itself into history. Years later, when the dust of that poisoned wedding feast had settled into the soil of West Virginia, the story still lingered like a stain that would not wash out. The mountains had witnessed countless tragedies, mine collapses, floods, feuds, but this one carried a different weight. It had begun not in violence, but in celebration, and perhaps that was why it never left the minds of those who survived. A wedding was meant to mark the start of life, yet for this community, it became a symbol of death, mistrust, and unanswered questions. The official records were thin. Death certificates, where they existed, listed vague causes: food poisoning, heart failure, convulsions. The local newspaper printed small articles in the weeks that followed, but even those accounts were fragmented, colored by rumor as much as fact. Some described spoiled meat. Others hinted at arsenic, perhaps slipped into a dish by a jealous rival. Still others claimed it was not poison at all, but an act of God, a plague sent to remind mortals of their fragile place in the order of things. No single explanation ever satisfied everyone. The truth, like the sickness itself, remained elusive. The bride and groom lived out their lives in shadows. Neighbors said they grew old together, never leaving the hollow, but never raising children. Their house was kept tidy, their garden well tended, yet visitors often remarked that no laughter ever echoed from its rooms. Some believed the bride never wore color again, her dresses forever muted in gray or black, as though she carried mourning on her shoulders every day. Others whispered that the groom drank heavily, his silence deepening with each year, as though he were carrying a confession he would never speak. By the time both were laid to rest, no one could say for certain whether their love had survived the burden of that night, or whether they had simply endured it together. Folklore grew in the absence of fact. Children dared one another to walk past the site of the feast after dark, swearing they could still hear coughing in the wind or see pale faces flicker in the trees. Hunters spoke of strange silence in the woods nearby, as if even the animals had not forgotten. And families who had lost loved ones passed down stories in hushed tones, warning each generation to be careful what they ate, careful whom they trusted, careful of joy that came too easily. The poisoned feast had become more than history. It had become a cautionary tale, a shadow woven into the culture of the valley. In the decades that followed, science advanced. Doctors learned to identify toxins, foodborne bacteria, and chemical agents that once went unnoticed. Modern scholars who look back on the event often suggest botulism, a deadly toxin that thrives in improperly preserved food. Others argue for deliberate poisoning, noting that arsenic was easy to obtain in the 1920s, sold in general stores as rat poison. But even these rational theories cannot fully account for the sheer terror described by witnesses, the convulsions, the sudden deaths, the violent fits that seemed to twist body and spirit alike. Science could explain the sickness, perhaps, but not the haunting silence that followed. That silence is what remains most unsettling. When communities face disaster, they often rally together, rebuilding what was lost. But here, in this valley, the poisoned feast carved a wound that never quite healed. Families drifted apart, trust dissolved. The idea of gathering in celebration carried with it an echo of dread. Even when people no longer spoke of it aloud, the memory lived in the way neighbors eyed one another, in the way food was prepared with extra caution, in the way joy was always tinged with restraint. It was not just lives that were lost, but innocence. And so the story lingers not as a neatly written chapter of history, but as a question without an answer. Did someone truly poison the food? Was it an accident of preservation, a tragic misstep of human hands? Or was it something larger, something inexplicable, that chose to reveal itself during a night of supposed joy? No matter how one frames it, the fact remains, dozens entered that wedding with laughter and too many left in coffins. The feast that should have bound families together instead fractured them forever. When we walk the ridges of West Virginia today, the landscape seems eternal, unchanged, unmoved, vast in its silence. Yet beneath that soil lie the bones of those who danced, sang, and celebrated on that fateful night. Their names have faded, their graves weathered, their stories fractured into rumor and folklore. And still, if you listen long enough to the hush of the trees, you may feel the weight of their absence, the chill of unfinished business lingering in the air. Perhaps that is why the poisoned wedding feast endures, not because of what we know, but because of what we cannot. It is a reminder that history is not always a record of facts, but often a tapestry of silence, suspicion, and fear. And in that silence, we are left to wonder how many other feasts ended in sorrow, how many other tragedies remain unspoken, and how many times joy has carried within it the seed of horror. The questions remain, echoing in the valleys of West Virginia, long after the last lamp was extinguished and the final song was silenced.